There are three phases that highly empathetic people move through in life, and most people never notice them because they're invisible from the outside. If you've lived through them, you'll recognize them immediately. If you haven't, they might sound exaggerated. But for the people who have experienced them, these phases explain years of confusion, exhaustion, strange relationship patterns, and moments where they felt completely disconnected from everyone around them. The interesting thing is that empathy is often misunderstood. Most people think empathy means being kind. It doesn't. Kindness is a behavior. Empathy is a perception system. An empathetic person walks into a room and notices things other people miss. Tiny shifts in tone, a forced smile, a hesitation before an answer. The emotional atmosphere between two people standing 10 feet apart. The tension behind someone's joke. They don't always know how they know. They just know. And because they know, they start carrying information that other people never even register. The first phase usually begins very early. This is the phase of absorption. In this phase, the empathetic person believes everyone experiences reality the same way they do. They assume everyone notices emotional undercurrents. They assume everyone can feel discomfort in a room. They assume everyone detects dishonesty. They assume everyone can tell when someone is hurting. And because they make that assumption, they spend years confused. They watch people ignore obvious emotional signals. They watch family members pretend everything is okay when it clearly isn't. They watch friends remain in toxic relationships that seem painfully obvious from the outside, and they can't understand why. The empathetic child often becomes the emotional weather station of the family. Nobody assigns them that role. It just happens. They become hyper-aware. They know when somebody is angry before a word is spoken. They know when somebody is disappointed before any criticism arrives. They know when conflict is coming before anyone else notices it. Over time, they start adjusting their behavior based on what they sense. Not what people say, what they sense. This is important, because this phase teaches a dangerous lesson. The lesson is that other people's emotional states are your responsibility. Nobody explicitly says it, but the empathetic person slowly learns it anyway. If mom is upset, fix it. If dad is stressed, adapt. If friends are uncomfortable, smooth things over. If someone is sad, help. If someone is angry, manage it. If someone is disappointed, absorb it. And eventually a pattern develops. The empathetic person becomes a regulator, not of themselves, of everyone else. The problem is that this works, at least temporarily. People appreciate them. People trust them. People confide in them. People feel understood around them. And this creates a powerful reward loop. The empathetic person begins receiving value through emotional service. Their worth becomes connected to helping. Their identity becomes connected to understanding. Their purpose becomes connected to carrying emotional weight. At first, this seems positive. It looks mature. It looks compassionate. It looks admirable. But underneath, something dangerous is forming. Because nobody taught them where other people end and they begin. So they absorb. They absorb frustration. They absorb sadness. They absorb fear. They absorb anxiety. They absorb tension. And eventually they become so accustomed to carrying emotional energy that they stop noticing the weight. Imagine putting a backpack on when you're 6 years old, then adding books every day. At first, you notice. Then you adapt. Then you forget you're carrying it. That's phase 1. The phase of absorption. The phase where empathy feels like a gift. The phase where helping feels natural. The phase where self-sacrifice feels normal. The phase where boundaries barely exist. And eventually, life introduces phase 2. This is where everything changes. This is the hardest phase. Not because it's painful, because it's confusing. Pain is easier than confusion. At least pain tells you where the problem is. Confusion hides it. Phase 2 is the phase of overload. Most empathetic people don't even realize they've entered it. They just start feeling different. More tired. More irritable. More withdrawn. More sensitive. More exhausted by things that never used to bother them. Suddenly, social interactions require recovery time. Suddenly, crowded environments feel draining. Suddenly, certain friendships feel unbearable. Suddenly, conversations that once felt meaningful now feel heavy. The empathetic person starts wondering what happened. They think they're becoming antisocial. They think they're becoming negative. They think they're losing patience. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is accumulation. Years of emotional absorption are finally reaching capacity. Think of empathy like a sponge. A sponge is useful because it absorbs, but every sponge has a limit. Nobody talks about that. Everybody celebrates absorption. Very few people discuss saturation. Phase 2 begins when saturation arrives. The empathetic person starts recognizing a disturbing reality. Not everyone wants help. Not everyone wants healing. Not everyone wants solutions. Not everyone wants growth. Some people want attention. Some people want validation. Some people want rescue. Some people want an audience. This realization hits hard, because Phase 1 was built on the belief that understanding people would create healthy relationships. Phase 2 reveals something different. Understanding people doesn't guarantee healthy relationships. In fact, sometimes it attracts unhealthy ones. The empathetic person begins noticing a pattern. Certain people always call during a crisis. Certain people always need support. Certain people always need advice. Certain people always need reassurance. But when the empathetic person struggles, those same individuals disappear. This creates internal conflict, because empaths naturally look inward first. Instead of questioning the relationship, they question themselves. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm becoming cold. Years can pass like this. The empathetic person repeatedly extends grace, repeatedly gives second chances, repeatedly explains behavior away, repeatedly understands people who make no effort to understand them, and eventually, something cracks. Not dramatically, quietly. One day they stop answering immediately. One day they don't volunteer to fix everything. One day they choose rest instead of rescue, and the reactions they receive become revealing. Some people become angry. Some people become distant. Some people become manipulative. Some people become offended. And suddenly the empathetic person discovers something shocking. Certain relationships were built almost entirely on access. Access to attention. Access to emotional labor. Access to energy. Access to support. The moment access changes, the relationship changes. This realization hurts. Not because the empathetic person loses people, because they lose illusions. And losing illusions feels like losing reality itself. Everything must be reevaluated. Friendships, family dynamics, romantic relationships, professional relationships. Every connection suddenly gets examined under a new lens. And during this phase, loneliness becomes common. Not because nobody is around, because authenticity is increasing. The empathetic person can no longer tolerate interactions that once felt acceptable. Small talk becomes exhausting. Performative behavior becomes obvious. Manipulation becomes visible. Emotional games become impossible to ignore. They begin noticing patterns everywhere. Who asks questions and who only talks. Who listens and who waits to speak. Who gives and who takes. Who supports and who extracts. It's like turning on a light in a room that was always dim. Once you've seen clearly, it's difficult to go back. This phase often feels isolating because the empathetic person is shedding old identities. They are no longer the fixer, no longer the emotional caretaker, no longer the automatic rescuer. And when those identities disappear, an uncomfortable question emerges. Who am I, if I'm not helping everyone? That question sits at the center of Phase 2, because many empathetic people built their entire self-worth around usefulness. Not existence, usefulness. There's a difference. When worth comes from usefulness, rest feels guilty. Boundaries feel selfish. Saying no feels wrong. Receiving feels uncomfortable. The empathetic person must confront all of this. And that's why Phase 2 is the hardest. Not because the outside world changes, because the internal operating system changes. Everything gets challenged. Every assumption, every pattern, every belief. The people who survive this phase begin developing something they never had before. Discernment, not judgment. Discernment. Judgment says everyone is bad. Discernment says everyone is different. Judgment closes doors. Discernment chooses doors carefully. This distinction matters, because Phase 2 isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming accurate. The empathetic person learns a powerful truth. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Understanding without limits becomes exhaustion. Giving without replenishment becomes depletion. Love without wisdom becomes vulnerability to manipulation. These lessons are rarely learned intellectually. They're learned through experience, repeated experience, painful experience, the kind that changes behavior permanently, and eventually something remarkable happens. The empathetic person stops trying to save everyone, not because they stopped caring, because they started understanding. They understand that growth requires participation, healing requires participation, change requires participation. You cannot carry somebody into a life they refuse to walk toward. This realization marks the transition into Phase 3. Phase 3 is integration. This is where empathy transforms from a burden into a skill. In Phase 1, empathy controlled them. In Phase 2, empathy overwhelmed them. In Phase 3, empathy serves them. Everything becomes different. The empathetic person still notices emotional shifts, still reads rooms, still senses tension, still detects dishonesty, but they no longer absorb everything. Observation replaces absorption. That's the difference. They can recognize sadness without carrying it, recognize anger without inheriting it, recognize fear without adopting it, recognize dysfunction without becoming responsible for it. This changes every relationship. The empathetic person becomes calmer, more selective, more intentional, less reactive, more grounded. For the first time, they realize that understanding someone doesn't require sacrificing themselves. They can care without collapsing, support without rescuing, love without losing themselves, listen without absorbing. This phase feels strange initially, because peace often feels unfamiliar to people who spent years managing chaos. Many empaths unconsciously become accustomed to emotional intensity. Calmness feels boring. Stability feels suspicious. Healthy relationships feel unusual. But over time, the nervous system adjusts. The empathetic person begins appreciating consistency, predictability, mutual respect, reciprocity. They stop confusing struggle with connection. They stop confusing sacrifice with love. They stop confusing exhaustion with purpose. And perhaps most importantly, they stop apologizing for boundaries, because they finally understand what boundaries actually are. Boundaries are not walls. They're filters. Walls keep everyone out. Filters let the right people in. This distinction changes everything. Healthy people respect boundaries. Manipulative people challenge them. Self-aware people appreciate clarity. Entitled people resist it. Boundaries reveal character faster than almost anything else. And Phase 3 empaths learn to pay attention to those revelations. Not emotionally, objectively. They stop explaining away red flags, stop rationalizing unhealthy behavior, stop negotiating with obvious patterns. They trust observation, trust consistency, trust evidence. This creates a new kind of confidence. Not loud confidence, quiet confidence. The confidence that comes from self-trust. Because ultimately, that's what the journey was about all along. Trusting perception, trusting intuition, trusting observation, trusting experience. For years, many empaths receive messages that encourage them to doubt themselves. You're too sensitive. You're overthinking. You're imagining things. You're reading too much into it. But Phase 3 teaches something different. Sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was interpretation. The problem was believing every signal required action. Every emotion required intervention. Every discomfort required responsibility. Once that belief disappears, empathy becomes extraordinarily powerful. The empathetic person can walk into a room and understand dynamics without becoming trapped by them. Can recognize deception without becoming obsessed by it. Can identify pain without becoming consumed by it. Can support people without abandoning themselves. This is maturity. Not the elimination of empathy, the refinement of empathy. The transformation of empathy from unconscious reaction into conscious awareness. And when you meet somebody in Phase 3, there's something different about them. You notice it immediately. They listen deeply, but they don't carry desperation. They care deeply, but they don't chase. They understand people, but they aren't controlled by people. There's a steadiness about them, a grounded quality, an emotional balance that wasn't present before, because they have learned something that took years to understand. Possibly decades. Empathy is not the ability to feel everything. Empathy is the ability to understand without losing yourself. And only those who have traveled through absorption, survived overload, and arrived at integration truly understand how difficult that journey can be. They know what it's like to carry emotions that were never theirs. They know what it's like to confuse responsibility with love. They know what it's like to wake up exhausted without understanding why. They know what it's like to outgrow relationships that once defined their lives. They know what it's like to feel alone in a crowded room. They know what it's demand. They know what it's like to discover that some people loved their availability more than they loved them. They know what it's like to rebuild an identity from the ground up. And they know something else. The hardest phase was never the exhaustion, never the loneliness, never the disappointment. The hardest phase was realizing that the person they spent years trying to protect, support, understand, encourage, rescue, validate, and heal was everyone except themselves, because somewhere along the way they learned to monitor every emotional signal in the world while ignoring their own, and the moment they finally turned that same awareness inward, everything began to change.